The morning sun hung low over a quiet stretch of farmland, painting the fields in soft gold. It was the kind of place people passed without a second glance. No crowds, no noise, no drama, just rows of crops, a wooden fence, and two men working side by side like they had done 1,000 times before. They looked ordinary, almost forgettable. Both wore faded shirts, worn boots, and old hats pulled low against the sun. One of them moved with slow, deliberate motions, lifting crates and setting them down with care. The other leaned against a fence, hands resting casually, eyes scanning the land with a calm that felt almost unnatural. To anyone watching from a distance, they were just two aging farmers trying to get through another long day. No one would have guessed they were legends. There were no bodyguards, no luxury cars, no signs of fame or power. Just dirt under their boots and silence in the air. Locals passed by on bicycles and trucks, nodding politely, never stopping long enough to wonder who these men really were. That's when the trouble arrived. A group of young men appeared at the edge of the road, their laughter cutting through the calm like a blade. Loud voices, cocky swagger. They slowed down when they noticed the farm, and more importantly, the two men on it. Their eyes lingered, measuring, judging, two old farmers. Alone, quiet, an easy target. One of them smirked and said something to the others. They laughed harder and began walking closer, boots crunching against gravel. From their perspective, this wasn't a confrontation, it was entertainment. A chance to feel powerful by intimidating people who clearly couldn't fight back. The two farmers noticed them immediately, but they didn't react the way most people would. No panic, no sudden movements, no fear. One of the men simply straightened up and wiped his hands on a cloth. The other turned his head slightly, his eyes calm, focused, almost amused. They exchanged a brief glance. No words were spoken, yet something passed between them. An understanding. A silent readiness. The gang mistook that silence for weakness. They had no idea that one of these ordinary farmers was Chuck Norris. They had no idea the other was Seagal. And they certainly had no idea that the next few minutes were about to become the biggest mistake of their lives. Because sometimes the most dangerous people in the world don't look dangerous at all. The gang didn't rush in all at once. They took their time, spreading out as they walked closer. Like predators enjoying the moment before a strike. Their laughter grew louder, more deliberate, meant to be heard. One of them kicked a loose stone toward the fence, watching to see if either of the farmers would flinch. They didn't. Chuck remained near the fence, posture relaxed, one hand resting casually on the wood. Stephen stood by the crates, shoulders loose, breathing steady. From the outside, it looked like indifference. From the inside, it was awareness, sharp, controlled, and complete. "Hey, old men," one of the gang members called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "This your land?" No answer. Another stepped forward, grinning. "Looks like it. Must be nice. Real quiet out here. No cops, no cameras." The others laughed again, louder this time. Stephen slowly turned his head, not with annoyance, but with polite attention, like someone acknowledging a stranger who'd spoken out of turn. "We're working," he said calmly. "You should move along." The words were simple, respectful, almost gentle, that only made things worse. The leader scoffed. "Hear that? He's telling us what to do." He looked back at his friends, feeding off their reactions. "You got some nerve." "Farmer." Chuck shifted his weight slightly, boots pressing into the dirt. It was a small movement, easy to miss, but it changed everything. His eyes stayed on the group now. Not aggressive, not angry, just focused. The gang noticed the silence, the lack of fear, and they hated it. One of them walked closer to the crates, invading Stephen's space. "What are you gonna do if we don't leave?" he asked, leaning in. "You gonna call someone?" Stephen didn't step back, he didn't raise his voice. "No," he replied. That single word hung in the air longer than it should have. For a moment, even the gang seemed unsure how to react. They were used to protests, to pleading, to anger. But this calm refusal unsettled them. So they escalated. Another gang member circled behind Chuck, clapping slowly. "They think they're tough." Chuck finally spoke, his voice low and even. "There's no reason for this." The leader laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. "You hear that? He's trying to talk his way out." He stepped closer, close enough to smell the dust and sweat on Chuck's shirt. "You should have kept your mouth shut." Still, Chuck didn't move. Stephen glanced at him briefly. Just a fraction of a second. That was all it took. The gang mistook that glance for hesitation. One of them shoved a crate with his foot, sending it scraping across the ground. "Oops," he said sarcastically, clumsy. Stephen looked down at the crate, then back up at the man. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. The calm was still there, but now it carried weight. The kind of calm that comes from certainty. That was the moment the air shifted. Not because of what Chuck or Stephen did, but because of what they didn't do. No panic, no shouting, no threats, just control. And standing there, watching this unfold, I know exactly what I would have been thinking. Before we go any further, tell me, what city and country are you watching from? And honestly, if I were standing nearby, watching this situation play out, I'd be thinking, these guys think they're in control, but they're pushing people who aren't reacting at all. And that's dangerous, because the people who stay calm when they're being threatened usually know something everyone else doesn't. Now it's your turn. If you were there, watching this scene unfold, what would you be thinking in that moment? Back on the farm, the gang had crossed from intimidation into arrogance. They were no longer testing. They were assuming victory, and that assumption was about to cost them dearly, because what they still didn't understand was this. Chuck Norris and Seagal weren't staying calm because they were afraid. They were staying calm because they were deciding how this would end. And once that decision was made, there would be no going back. The gang could feel it now. The shift, the silence wasn't empty anymore. It pressed down on them. Thick and uncomfortable like the moment before a storm breaks. They had come expecting fear. Instead, they were met with restraint. And restraint, to men like them, felt like disrespect. The leader took another step forward, close enough that Stephen could feel his breath. "You deaf," he said. "We're still here." Stephen didn't move. His hands stayed relaxed at his sides, fingers loose, shoulders down. "You should leave," he repeated, voice calm and level. "There's no reason for this to get worse." That sentence should have been a warning. But warnings only matter when you understand who they're coming from. The gang laughed again, though this time it sounded thinner. One of them shook his head. "Listen to this guy, talking like he's in charge." He looked at Chuck. "You too scared to speak up now?" Chuck finally raised his eyes fully. Not sharply, not aggressively, just enough to let them see he was paying attention. "Walk away," he said, "while you can." That did it. The leader's smile vanished. He gestured with his hand, and two of the others stepped closer, boxing them in. Their bodies closed the space, turning open ground into a cage. This was the moment they'd been waiting for, the moment they believed the farmers would crack. But they didn't. Chuck adjusted his stance slightly, feet grounding into the dirt. It wasn't obvious. Anyone else would have missed it. But it was the kind of adjustment made by someone who understood balance, distance, and timing on an instinctive level. Stephen noticed it instantly. The gang didn't. One of them reached down and picked up a tool from the ground, a harmless piece of farm equipment, but heavy enough to make a point. He twirled it in his hand, smirking. "Maybe you'll listen now." Stephen's eyes followed the movement, calm and precise. "Put that down," he said. The man laughed and stepped closer instead. That's when the locals started paying attention. A truck slowed on the road. Someone stopped walking. A woman across the field froze, sensing that something wasn't right. Everyone could feel the tension now, even if they didn't understand it. Still, Stephen and Chuck remained controlled. No fists clenched, no raised voices, no threats, just presence. And watching this unfold, I know exactly what would be going through my mind. If I were standing there in Steven Seagal's place, I wouldn't argue, I wouldn't shout, I wouldn't try to explain who I was. I'd stay calm and let them talk themselves into a mistake. Because when someone is fueled by ego, all you have to do is give them time. Back at the farm, the gang mistook that calm for surrender. The leader stepped even closer, invading Steven's space completely now. "You don't get it, old man," he said. "Out here, respect is taken." Stephen looked at him for a long moment, Not with anger, but with something closer to disappointment. "No," he said quietly. "Respect is earned." That single sentence landed harder than any punch. Chuck took one slow step forward, placing himself just slightly between Stephen and the gang. It wasn't a threat. It was a line being drawn. The gang leader scoffed. "You two really think you can stop us?" Chuck's answer was simple. "We don't think," he said. "We know." For the first time, uncertainty crept into their faces. Not fear yet, but doubt. Something about these men didn't add up. Their voices, their posture, the way they didn't react, the way victims were supposed to. The man holding the tool hesitated. That hesitation was everything. Because in moments like this, hesitation means the balance has shifted. The gang had wanted dominance. They had expected fear. What they got instead was patience. And patience, in the hands of men who had spent lifetimes mastering control, was far more dangerous than anger. They were still standing, still talking, still unaware. But the window for walking away was closing fast. And once it closed, there would be no second chances. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The wind brushed through the fields, bending the crops in slow waves, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The gang stood frozen in place, caught between confidence and doubt. They had pushed far past where most people would have backed down. But something about these two men made it feel different, wrong. The leader felt it too. That feeling irritated him. He glanced at his crew, then back at Chuck and Stephen. "You hear how quiet it is," he said, forcing a laugh. "That's because nobody's coming to help you." Chuck didn't respond. He didn't need to. His eyes were steady, his breathing controlled. Every movement around him registered, distance, angles, weight shifts. He looked relaxed, but inside, his awareness was razor-sharp. Stephen's gaze never left the leader. "You should stop," Stephen said calmly. "Right now." The leader's jaw tightened. He hated being told what to do, especially by someone who looked like he shouldn't be a threat. That calm voice felt like an insult, like pity. So he made a decision, the wrong one. He stepped forward and shoved Stephen in the chest. It wasn't a hard push, not meant to injure. Just enough to assert dominance, to say, "I can touch you, and there's nothing you can do about it." The moment his hand made contact, the air changed. Stephen didn't stumble. He didn't react the way the leader expected. He simply absorbed the motion, feet shifting slightly in the dirt, balance adjusting as if by instinct. His expression didn't change, but Chuck noticed something else. Stephen's shoulders settled. That was the signal. Chuck moved, not fast, not slow, just enough to reposition himself. To anyone watching, it might have looked like nothing, but to Stephen, it was confirmation. A silent agreement. The line had been crossed. The gang leader smirked. "See," he said. Nothing happened. But the others weren't laughing now. One of them took a step back without realizing it. Another swallowed hard. Something deep inside them recognized danger, even if their minds refused to accept it. Stephen spoke again, his voice still calm, but firmer now. "Don't touch me again," the leader scoffed. "Or what?" He reached out a second time. That was the fatal mistake. If I were watching this moment unfold, the second that hand landed on Stephen's chest, I'd be thinking, that's it. He just crossed a line he doesn't even know exists. And if I were in the gang leader's place, drunk on confidence, surrounded by my crew, I'd probably think I was still in control, right up until the exact second I realized I wasn't back on the farm. The leader's hand came forward again, but this time, it never reached its target. Stephen turned slightly, redirecting the motion with effortless precision. No anger, no force, just timing. The leader felt his balance disappear, his weight suddenly working against him instead of for him. He stumbled, not dramatically, but enough to shock him. Chuck stepped forward at the same time, not to strike, but to close space. His presence alone was overwhelming. The gang felt it instantly. This wasn't chaos. This was control. Everything they thought they understood about the situation unraveled in a heartbeat. The leader tried to recover, embarrassment flashing across his face. "You think that was something?" he snapped, trying to save face. "You've had every chance to walk away," he said. "This is on you." The gang members exchanged uneasy glances. They could feel it now. Something had shifted beyond their control. What started as intimidation had turned into exposure. They weren't dealing with victims. They were dealing with men who knew exactly what they were doing. The leader clenched his fists, torn between backing down and doubling down. Pride won. He lunged. That single decision sealed everything that followed. Because once movement turned to action, there was no more room for misunderstanding. No more room for retreat. The moment had arrived. And whatever happened next would happen fast. The leader lunged forward with raw aggression, swinging without strategy, without thought. It was the kind of attack fueled by wounded pride rather than skill. To him, this was about saving face, about proving that he was still in charge. To Stephen, it was simply momentum. Stephen didn't step back, he stepped inside the attack. The movement was subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye. His body turned, his arm guiding the leader's force past its target. There was no strike, no explosive motion, just redirection. The leader felt his own weight betray him, his balance collapsing as his arm was twisted off its natural line. In the same breath, Stephen applied pressure, not enough to injure, just enough to teach. The leader froze, his arm locked in a position that sent a sharp, unmistakable message through his nervous system. Pain, not overwhelming, but precise, shot through him. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The gang panicked. Two of them stepped forward instinctively, but Chuck moved at the same moment. Not violently, not wildly. He simply arrived in their space. And that was enough. Chuck's presence was different from Stephen's. Where Stephen was calm and fluid, Chuck was solid, unmovable. He didn't need to touch anyone. His posture alone communicated certainty, finality. "Don't," Chuck said quietly. The word landed like a wall. The men hesitated, trapped between loyalty and self-preservation. Every instinct screamed that this situation was no longer under their control. The farmers they thought they could bully were dismantling them without breaking a sweat. The leader tried to pull away, but the more he resisted, the tighter Stephen's control became. Stephen leaned in slightly, his voice low enough that only the leader could hear. "You're done," he said. "This ends now." The leader's face flushed, not just from pain but from humiliation. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to be feared. Instead, he was being restrained, effortlessly, by a man who hadn't raised his voice once. The rest of the gang stood frozen. This was the moment where things could have turned truly violent, but they didn't. Because Chuck took another step forward, positioning himself so the others couldn't get a clear angle. His eyes moved from one face to the next, calm and unreadable. "You want to make this worse?" he asked. "Or do you want to walk away?" No one answered. The leader's breathing was ragged now. Stephen released the pressure slightly, not out of mercy, but control. Enough to let him think. Enough to let him feel the weight of his choices. That's when sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Simone had called it in. The sound shattered whatever confidence the gang had left. One of them swore under his breath. Another glanced toward the road. They were no longer thinking about dominance. They were thinking about consequences. Stephen finally let go. The leader staggered back, clutching his arm, eyes wide. He didn't attack again. He didn't even speak. The fight had drained out of him completely. Chuck stepped back beside Stephen, the two men standing shoulder to shoulder again, exactly as they had at the beginning. But everything was different now. If I were in that gang leader's position right now, embarrassed, exposed, hearing sirens in the distance, I know exactly what I'd do. I'd back away. I'd swallow my pride, and I'd be grateful I was still standing, because some lessons cost far more when you insist on learning them the hard way. Now you tell me. At this point, would you run, or would you try to talk your way out? The gang began retreating, slowly at first, then faster. No threats, no last words. Just a messy exit fueled by fear and disbelief. The leader threw one final look over his shoulder. Less anger now, more confusion. Like he was trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. The locals who had stopped to watch emerged cautiously, whispering among themselves. They didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They simply stared at Chuck and Stephen with a new kind of respect, two ordinary farmers. That's what everyone still thought. Stephen exhaled slowly, tension leaving his shoulders at last. "You okay?" he asked Chuck. Chuck nodded. They chose poorly. The sirens grew louder, and with them came the moment of truth, because the next people to arrive wouldn't judge them by intimidation or numbers, but by facts. And facts, as it turned out, were very much on their side. The sirens grew louder, no longer distant echoes, but a steady presence cutting through the open fields. Red and blue lights flashed against the trees, washing the dirt road in sharp color. What had started as a quiet act of intimidation was now officially something much bigger. The gang stopped retreating. They didn't run, but they didn't turn back either. They stood awkwardly near their vehicles, suddenly unsure of where to put their hands, where to look, or how to explain what had just happened. 2 patrol cars pulled in first, doors opened. Officers stepped out, hands resting near their belts, eyes scanning the scene. They took in everything at once. The shaken gang, the gathering locals, and 2 older men standing calmly near the field, as if nothing unusual had happened. One of the officers approached Stephen and Chuck. "We got a call about a disturbance," he said. "Anyone hurt?" Stephen shook his head. "No injuries," he replied evenly. "Just a misunderstanding." The gang leader let out a short, nervous laugh. "Yeah," he said quickly, "misunderstanding." But the officer wasn't looking at him anymore. He was looking at Chuck. The officer paused, squinting slightly. His expression changed, not dramatically, but noticeably. He took a step closer, studying Chuck's face from a different angle. "Sir," he said slowly, "can I ask your name?" Chuck met his gaze. "Chuck." The officer's eyes widened just a fraction. "And your last name?" Chuck hesitated for half a second, not out of fear, but out of familiarity with what usually followed. "Norris." The officer went still. For a brief, unreal moment, the field fell completely silent. Then the officer took a step back, clearing his throat. "As in Chuck Norris." A ripple ran through the onlookers. Whispers spread instantly. Phones came up again. But this time, not to record a conflict. To capture disbelief. Chuck nodded once. "That's me." The gang leader's face drained of color. Before he could even process that shock, another officer approached Stephen. This one looked younger, but his reaction was even stronger. He stared openly now, eyes darting between Stephen's face and his posture. "Sir," the officer said, almost unsure of his own voice. "You're Stephen Seagal, aren't you?" Stephen sighed softly. Not annoyed, just resigned. "Yes," he said, "I am." That was it. The world flipped. The gang members froze, staring as if the ground had shifted under their feet. These weren't farmers. These weren't ordinary men. These were legends. Names they'd heard their entire lives, now standing calmly in front of them. The leader stumbled back a step. That's not possible," he muttered. "You didn't say anything." Stephen looked at him calmly. "You didn't ask." The officers exchanged looks. The tone of the situation changed instantly. From confrontation to clarity. Statements were taken. Witnesses spoke up. Locals explained how the gang had initiated everything, how Stephen and Chuck had tried repeatedly to de-escalate. The truth was unavoidable. The gang leader's shoulders sagged. All the arrogance, all the bravado he'd walked in with had evaporated. He wasn't angry anymore. He was embarrassed, deeply. If I were that gang leader, the second I heard those names, Chuck Norris and Stephen Seagal, my stomach would drop. Not because they're famous, but because I'd realize I had judged men by appearances and paid the price. And if I were standing there knowing I'd ignored every warning, I'd be thinking one thing: I should have walked away when I had the chance. Now answer honestly, at this moment. What would you be feeling? Fear, regret, or disbelief? One of the senior officers finally spoke, his tone firm but controlled. "You're all going to need to explain your actions," he said to the gang. "Because from what we're hearing, you're the ones who escalated this." No one argued. There was nothing left to argue with. As the gang was separated and questioned, the crowd's mood shifted. People weren't cheering. They weren't mocking. They were quietly impressed, not by violence, but by restraint. Stephen stood off to the side, hands folded, speaking politely with an officer. Chuck answered a few questions, keeping his responses short and respectful. No bragging, no name, dropping, no ego, just dignity. And that, more than anything else, left the deepest impression on everyone watching, because power had been revealed, but never abused. And that made all the difference. By the time the patrol cars pulled away, the field felt different. Quieter, but lighter. The gang was gone, their vehicles disappearing down the road under police supervision. What remained was a small group of locals standing in silence, replaying what they had just witnessed. Not a fight, not a brawl, but a lesson, delivered with control, restraint, and dignity. Someone finally broke the silence. "I still can't believe that just happened." Chuck gave a faint smile. "Neither can we," he said. Stephen glanced around at the people who had gathered. "You all okay?" he asked. "Sorry you had to see that." That humility hit harder than anything else that day. These were men who could have dominated the situation in seconds. Yet they chose patience. They chose to give every opportunity for peace. And when action became unavoidable, they acted with precision, not anger. Word spread quickly. Within hours, videos from the scene surfaced online. Clips showing the gang's aggression. Clips showing Stephen's calm restraint. Clips capturing the moment the names were revealed. The comments flooded in from all over the world. True strength is self-control. They didn't have to prove anything, and that's why they won. This is how real men handle conflict. The story went viral, not because of violence, but because of contrast. Ordinary-looking farmers, extraordinary discipline. Interviews followed, reporters reached out, but Stephen and Chuck declined most of them. When asked why, Chuck answered simply, "There's nothing to explain." Stephen added, "We didn't do anything special. We just treated people the way we'd want to be treated." The authorities later confirmed what everyone already knew. The gang had been at fault. Charges were filed. Consequences followed. But the real punishment wasn't legal. It was humiliation. They had underestimated the wrong people, ignored clear warnings, and learned, far too late, that appearance means nothing. Days later, life returned to normal on the farm. Crops still needed tending. Work still needed doing. The world moved on, but for those who had witnessed it, and for millions who watched it online, something lingered. A reminder that real power doesn't announce itself, that respect can't be forced, and that sometimes the most dangerous people in the room are the ones who remain calm. Stephen and Chuck never spoke about the incident again. They didn't need to, because the lesson had already traveled far beyond that field. If this story reminded you that true strength is calm, not chaos, if you believe respect is earned, not taken, and if you think no one should be judged by how they look, type respect in the comments right now. And if you want more powerful stories where arrogance meets humility and the truth always comes out, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the next story might change the way you see strength forever.